please be seated.
Yes, Ms Finnett.
Thank you, Your Honour. Your Honour, it was indicated earlier that we would be calling...
Seated.
Yes, Ms Finnett.
Thank you, Your Honour. Your Honour, it was indicated earlier that we would be calling...
Your microphone's not doing the job.
Sorry. It was indicated earlier that we would be calling Dan Torpey to give evidence this morning. We've been provided with a medical certificate in relation to Mr Torpey that suggests that he is admitted to hospital and is unlikely to be in a position to give evidence anytime soon. I'll provide copies of that certificate.
Has he received a summons?
He has, Your Honour.
Well, then I need to indicate that we won't call upon that summons today.
Your Honour, Mr Torpey gave evidence in a private hearing, and I propose to tender the transcript of that hearing, and that's been made available, I think, this morning, but I'm sure no one's had an opportunity to read it, and it may be if there is anyone who wishes to make a submission as to questioning Mr Torpey, they could do so as soon as they can, and then perhaps Your Honours and Commissioner will consider, based on the medical evidence, whether that's likely.
And for those who haven't seen it, the medical report makes plain that he's in no condition to give evidence today, and we couldn't ask him to do that. The course you suggest is sensible, and if there's a need to ask him questions at some stage, we can always make arrangements to do that in an ad hoc way if need be.
If Your Honour wishes me to tender the...
I think you should, and I'll make it Exhibit 28145, but I'll suppress it from publication.
Now, as I understand it, there's arrangements have been made at the nursing home for Bishop to give evidence.
And Bishop Malkerns? Bishop Malkerns?
Yes.
Can you see me? It's Justice McClellan talking. Can you see me?
I can now, yes.
Right. And you can hear me, obviously.
Yes.
You will need to be sworn to tell the truth. Do you understand?
Yes.
And is there a Bible there?
Yes.
Would you take the Bible in your hand, please? Do you have it in your hand?
I do.
And repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give in this Royal Commission
that the evidence I shall give in this royal
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Yes, thank you. You can put the Bible down. Now, Ms Finesse is going to start by asking you some questions.
What is your full name?
Ronald Austin Malkerns,
What is your date of birth?
the 11th of November.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that, Bishop.
The 11th of November 1930.
Thank you. And you're residing in a nursing home?
Yes.
How long have you been in the nursing home?
Since August or early September, I'm not sure which.
What year?
Last year.
And where were you living before you moved into the nursing home?
I was living in a house in Fairhaven.
I'm sorry, the house of...
a house in Fairhaven.
And that was a house that was owned by the diocese?
No, it was owned by me.
It was a privately owned home by you. Is that right?
Yes.
Did you live alone?
Yes.
When did you last work for the Catholic Church, Bishop?
Well, I retired from the job of bishop in 1997. Then I was national chaplain to the Southern Cross for a number of years after that.
When were you first appointed as a priest to a position?
I was appointed as a priest in Melbourne. I was ordained for in Melbourne, and the first appointment was, apart from a Christmas appointment, appointment at Mentone.
When did you first move to Ballarat?
1968.
What position did you take up in 1968?
I was Clergy bishop.
What did that
Which
entail?
meant-
I beg your pardon, you didn't finish your answer.
Well, it meant that I was I would take over when the present bishop retired. The bishop in those days retired.
And who was the bishop in those days?
Bishop O'Collins.
Did you reside with Bishop O'Collins at any time?
No, apart from a couple of days first into the diocese, but
When were you... I beg your pardon.
sorry.
I didn't hear the end of your answer, Bishop. You said for a couple of days when...
Well, when I first went to the diocese,
When were you made bishop?
in 1968.
So that was when you were coadjutor bishop,
Yes.
and you became Bishop of Ballarat when?
In 1971.
How many priests were there within your diocese when you took over the role as Bishop of Ballarat?
I couldn't say, I don't remember.
Well, was it in the teens? Was it dozens? Was it hundreds?
I know it was less than 100 when I first took over during the, because it did top the 100 when I was bishop. But,
You said it did top the hundreds.
yes, after that was after I was there.
So the number of bishops in your diocese grew during the period you were bishop, is that right?
No bishops, the number of priests.
I'm sorry, the number of priests in your diocese grew during the period you were bishop.
Yes, well, it grew and then declined. It was probably about the early 1970s was its peak.
And then it fell away after that?
Yes.
As Bishop of Ballarat, did you have a role in deciding whether those in the seminary would get an appointment within your diocese?
Yes, on the recommendation of the staff at the seminary.
But it was ultimately your call whether you would take someone or not. Is that right? Did you reject any seminarians who wanted to work within your diocese?
I can't recall.
You can't recall whether you did or you didn't?
That's right.
From your experience as a bishop having discussions with other bishops in conferences and the like, was it something that happened as a matter of routine or more rarely that a bishop would reject someone from the seminary to be part of their diocese?
It wasn't something that happened frequently, as far as I remember, but it was always the bishop's call to have somebody ordained to it.
Now, you were bishop for some 25, 26 years.
Yes.
How old were you when you retired?
I was 60. 68, I think.
Did you?
I took it in 97.
Now, that was young. I beg your pardon, Bishop.
Yes. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. Thank you.
No, I did retire early.
Why did you retire early?
There were two things. I wasn't handling myself very well, in the sense that I was not doing the job as well as I felt I should be doing. And so I retired on that basis.
Who told you you weren't handling it all very well and you weren't doing the job as well as you should have?
I don't recall anybody telling me that.
Did you form that view yourself?
Yes.
What was it that you weren't handling well that you thought?
Well, there were problems with the priests in the classes. I didn't seem to be handling them as well as I should have. And I'd like to say, if I may, that I'm terribly sorry that I do things differently in that time. But I didn't really know what to do or how to do it.
What were the problems that you're describing with priests in the diocese?
Oh, there were a number of cases of paedophilia, and that was the basic problem, really.
Well, was the problem that there were a number of cases of paedophilia, or was the problem that you hadn't dealt properly with those cases of paedophilia?
Well, it was probably both. I certainly regret that I didn't deal differently with the case of paedophilia. We had no idea, I had no idea of the effects of the incidents that took place But yeah, that's. But I thought it was.
How do you think you should have done it differently, Bishop?
Oh, I don't know now. It just would have been to, I suppose, to treat the complaints differently. And as I say, I'm terribly sorry that I didn't treat them differently.
By differently, you mean seriously, don't you?
And then so,
By differently, you mean seriously.
well, yes, I suppose that is true. I did want to take it all seriously, and then, as I say, in those days, it's a long time ago, we didn't really know quite how to deal with these things. Well, I didn't anyway.
Bishop, the Church had known for centuries that the sodomy of small boys and the rape of small girls was wrong.
Sure.
You knew it was wrong, didn't you?
Oh, yes, yes.
It had always been a crime, hadn't it?
I don't know, really.
You chose, in the way in which you dealt with complaints, to protect the reputation of the Church over protecting children within the diocese, didn't you?
No, that wasn't completely true. I was I certainly wanted to protect the reputation of the church. I wanted to make sure that these incidents didn't happen in the future, and tried my best to work in such a way that it didn't happen in the future. But of course, they don't tell you the truth about these things that are happening. So it makes it terribly difficult to treat them.
When you say they weren't telling you the truth about what was happening, are you suggesting that you asked any particular of your priests whether they were offending against children?
I don't recall any exact queries, but I tried to get treatment incidents that I knew about. But as I say, there were a lot of incidents that, because they simply weren't admitting them.
Well, when you say they simply weren't admitting them, who did you ask whether they were offending against children?
Well, put them in the queue of psychologists, and then I took notice of what the psychologists said about them, and in particular, of course, when they decided that it was okay for them to go back into a parish.
Bishop, that wasn't the question you were asked. Ms. Furness, would you put the question again?
When you say that they simply weren't admitting them, who did you ask whether they were offending against children?
Well, I asked the psychiatrist whether it was safe and reasonable
No, Bishop. Ms. Furness wants to know which of your priests you asked whether they were offending against children.
I can't recall.
You can't recall a single name of a priest who you asked whether they were offending?
No, not. I just can't recall that doing that anyway.
So you didn't ask any priest whether they were offending against children?
Well, I more or less asked through the psychologists rather than directly to the priests themselves.
So are we to understand that you had reports to you that priests were offending, but you never asked the priests whether those reports were true?
Oh, I can't recall that, and to what extent I asked them, and to what extent I.
Can you recall the name of any one of the offending priests that were in the diocese when you were bishop?
Yeah, well, there was Gerald Ridgedale was one. Paul David Ryan was another.
Any others?
I don't think of any.
I'm sorry, you can't think of any others?
No.
Is your memory, we know you've been unwell, is your memory now failing you in relation to these people?
Yes, it's been failing me for a long time. Since I had a stroke in 98, the year after I retired. But then I had an unexpected operation which detected cancer, and my memory has been well interfered with.
I understand. So does that mean if we were to ask you questions about what you did in the management of individual priests, you wouldn't be able to remember?
That would probably be so.
And if we asked you questions about your management of the diocese, would you be able to remember?
Oh, not specifically. I can't recall whatever the questions might be. It would be something I couldn't say at the stage.
It's the case, isn't it, Bishop, that the only reason you sent these priests off for treatment was because you believed that they had been offending. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's right.
So they admitted to you sufficiently for you to form the view that they were an offender, didn't they?
Well, they must have, yes.
Now, in relation to the treatment of these priests, can you tell us who generally you preferred as a counsellor, psychologist, psychiatrist to refer priests to in the 70s and 80s?
Well, I remember I referred General Ridsdale to a Father Augustine Watson, who was a psychiatrist and was working at the Melbourne School of Psychiatry, whatever, for the Melbourne Diocese anyway.
And you referred Ridsdale because you knew or sufficiently believed that he was offending against children, and Father Augustine Watson would treat him for that.
Yes.
So there was no question, was there, of you understanding that these priests were raping and indecently assaulting children?
Well, I didn't know to what extent these offences were, but I got the complaint against Ridsdale by a man who's the father of a victim, and so I said, well, he's out of there immediately, and he's being referred to a psychologist, and is that sufficient for me to do? And he said yes, and he was in fact a policeman, so it wasn't.
Where did you get the information from to suggest that Father Watson was an appropriate person to refer Ridsdale to?
I don't remember.
Was it somebody in the church?
I don't remember.
It's unlikely, isn't it, that you would have gone outside the church to find the name of someone to send a priest to who was sexually abusing children in the diocese, isn't it?
Well, yes, it's unlikely.
And in order to receive the name of a person to whom Ridsdale could go for treatment, you needed to disclose the treatment needed and the condition for which the treatment was needed, didn't you?
Well, I don't know. I just know that he had offended against this child, and something needs to be done about it.
But in order to do something that you thought was effective, you needed to find somebody who could do the job, didn't you?
Yes.
In order to do that, I suggest that you needed to talk to people in the church to find out who could do the job. Isn't that right?
Well, I don't remember doing that.
Well, how else would you have known of Father Watson being available for this sort of work?
Well, I just don't recall.
Did Bishop O'Collins tell you?
No, I don't think so.
Was it because there had been previous cases where you had the need to refer priests who were offending against children, and that's why you knew of Watson?
I just can't recall that.
When you referred Ridsdale for treatment, did you speak to the person who was providing the treatment in advance?
Oh, I can't remember.
Did you get a written report back?
Again, I don't remember.
Did you talk to them on the telephone?
Again, I don't remember.
Turning to Paul David Ryan, what do you remember about him?
Well, I remember that a complaint was made that there was a problem with what do you call it? Homosexuality. And, while that was in the front for the priests, it wasn't illegal. And that I sent him for treatment for homosexuality.
The problem, you say, was having adult relationships with another person? Was that the issue, given the vow of celibacy?
Yes.
When did you first become aware of Paul David Ryan offending against children?
I just don't recall.
You do remember that he did offend against children, don't you?
Yes, I heard that subsequently, but I just can't remember how.
There's a letter that is behind tab 4 of the Ryan tender bundle. Is there somebody with you who can show you that document?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Have you got that document?
Yes, I.
Now, it's a letter to you from the Reverend John F. Harvey from De Sales Hall School of Theology in Maryland.
Yes.
Now, is that a document you remember?
I don't remember the document, no, but.
You remember Reverend Harvey?
Yes.
And you remember the De Sales Hall School of Theology in Maryland?
I don't. Father Harvey came to Australia to give information about an organisation that he was either setting up or had set up for priest with homosexual problems. And yes, and it was when I heard Father Paul David Ryan.
When did he come to Australia?
Oh, I can't recall.
Before this letter was written in February 1977?
I can't recall.
Did you know of him before he came to Australia?
I can't recall having known of him.
When he came to Australia, I take it he spoke with more in the church rather than just yourself. Is that right?
Oh, yes.
And is it the case that you engaged him to assist you with Ryan because you had known of his work beforehand?
Yes.
And it's likely, therefore, that he came before early 77. Is that right?
I can't recall any dates.
When you said that he was setting up an organisation for priests with homosexual problems, was that euphemistic term for for priests sexually interfering with children?
No.
The reference to homosexual problems was a priest having an adult relationship with another man. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, if you look at this letter, you see that I don't think we can have it up here. Is that right? Perhaps we might provide a copy for the bench, if we can. Well, just one will do. But it's tab 4 behind the Ryan tender bundle. Yeah. Well, perhaps I'll read the document if it's not readily available.
We've got it. We've got it.
So tab 4.
Yep.
Now, the letter begins that Reverend Harvey has discussed the situation of Father Paul Ryan with a priest there, and continues to say it'd be wise to get more details from Australia before proceeding further. And then there's various discussions about where that might take place and what the treatment might be. And then there's reference in the second paragraph to, I would like Dr. Seale's comment on this proposal. Now, Dr. Seale was a psychiatrist used by the church in the 60s and 70s when offending priests came to light. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And you knew of Dr. Seale because there were discussions within the church as to who was available to treat priests who were sexually offending against children. Is that right?
Well, I can't remember these discussions with him.
How else would you have found out about these people?
Well, I just can't recall.
You can't recall how you did find out about them. Is that right?
That's right.
Does reading this letter help you, Bishop?
No.
If you see down to the last paragraph, it reads, the question was raised concerning Father Ryan's activity during his stay at a Catholic secondary college. Now, can you tell us whether that college was in the States or in Australia?
I can't recall.
And
I
then,
presume it was in the States, but I can't remember.
what then is asked is, what kind of homosexual activity was he involved in? And then by that, I mean with what age group? And then only with adults. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, from that it seems that Reverend Harvey, when referring to homosexual activity, was including adults and children within that term. Is that right?
Well, I don't know.
Was that how you read the letter?
No, I just don't know how to interpret his.
What's your view? Did you use the term homosexual activity to include either adults or children?
No, I was referring to adults.
Well, you weren't referring to adults with Father Paul Ryan, were you?
So yeah.
I beg your pardon?
Well, I was referring to adults with regard to Paul Ryan.
Well, you see that letter's February the 1st, 77. Perhaps if we can take you to the next tab, which is tab 5. And this is dated the 19th of February, 77.
Yes.
Now, do you recognise that as being a letter you've seen before? It's clear that you're not the author of that letter, Bishop, because you're referred to in the second paragraph.
Yes.
Can you help us with who wrote it? It seemed to be somebody working at Corpus Christi College.
That's the seminary. But I don't have any. I don't recollect it. Yeah.
Now, do you see the 5th paragraph on that first page?
Yeah.
There's reference there in the second sentence to during that time, that being when Ryan was teaching at a Catholic primary school in the north of Victoria, and I'm quoting, Paul was one of the informants to the bishop about the homosexual behaviour of a priest there at the time involving young boys. You see that?
Yes.
And it was the case, wasn't it, that Paul David Ryan told you from time to time about homosexual behaviour involving young boys?
I don't recall that.
You don't recall that he did that?
Yeah.
Did you have informants, Bishop, priests who would go out and find out about other priests offending against children and telling you about it?
No, there are no informants.
I beg your pardon?
There are no informants.
It was certainly on your radar at this time, wasn't it, in the mid-70s, that there were priests offending against boys in the diocese, and there was more than one. Isn't that right?
Yeah, there was. Yeah, well, I was becoming aware of it, yes.
And the reference again to homosexual behaviour involving young boys, is that the homosexual behaviour that you're referring to was in relation to young boys, or that was being referred to in this letter on your behalf. Is that right?
So I can't recall anything about it, really.
It seems likely, reading this letter, Bishop, that it is from the person at the seminary who was there when Paul David Ryan was a seminarian. If you turn over the second page, that becomes evident.
Yeah.
And then if you look on page 3, there's reference there in the first full paragraph for at least the preceding 18 months, and preceding, it appears to be mid-75 or thereabouts, Paul had been regularly involved with overt homosexual behaviour with other students. Do you see that?
Yeah.
And at the seminary, the ages of people who were generally there in the mid-70s was what?
Oh, that 18 to 25.
Now, there's reference 2 paragraphs down to Paul being sent to see a psychologist, Mr. Ron Conway. Do you see that?
Not.
It's the third full paragraph on page 3.
Yes, yes.
So it's the case, isn't it, by the mid-70s, the church had identified at least 4 people who were available to deal with priests who were offending against children. The psychologist, Mr. Conway, the psychiatrist, Dr. Seal, Reverend Harvey, and one additional, Watson, Augustine Watson. That's right?
Yes.
You must have known you had a pretty big problem on your hands, Bishop, if you had 4 people available to you, including one institute in the States, to deal with priests offending against children. Isn't that right?
Well, I simply can't remember anything about these things, but that's, yes,
What don't you remember anything about?
well, this letter and the contents.
You remember about having various people available to you to send priests for treatment, don't you?
I remember there were those people presumably available.
And you knew about those people being available because it was a matter that was being discussed in the church, wasn't it?
Oh, I don't recall any discussions.
Well, just turn over to the next tab, tab 6. This is a letter to you from John Harvey, dated May 3rd, 1977. Can you see that?
Yes.
And about a third of the way down, there's a reference to Paul Ryan agreeing to go to Dr. John Kinane, a clinical psychologist from the Catholic, presumably University of A. Do you see that?
No. I'm finding it a bit hard to read.
Take your time.
Yes, right, yeah.
So this is the fifth person that's been identified to you as somebody who you can go to deal with police offending against children. You agree with that?
Yes,
Do you remember John Kinane?
I remember the name. I have no recollection of John Kinane as a person.
When did you last read any of documents of the sort that I'm now showing you?
I had gone through some documents that were made available for the inquiry that there was in Melbourne.
You mean the Royal Commission inquiry or the Victorian Parliamentary inquiry?
The Victorian Parliamentary inquiry. So I sort of breezed through the letters that were made available then.
What do you mean breezed through, Bishop?
Well, there wasn't much time. It was just a question of seeing what the documents said without having to reaction about it.
Sorry, without having to what?
To take any action regarding the documents.
By which you mean you didn't give evidence to the Victorian Parliamentary inquiry about those documents. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, those representing you were provided with a bundle of documents, in fact, many bundles of documents concerning the inquiry the Royal Commission has into various institutions within the Diocese of Ballarat. Now, have they been given to you?
Recently, or
Well, over the last few months.
no, I haven't received any documents subsequent to the Victorian State inquiry.
So you haven't been provided before now with that bundle of documents which is in front of you?
No.
So you haven't read any of this material, is that right?
Yes.
Have you read anything to prepare for giving evidence today?
No, I haven't.
None of the interviews you may have had with people in relation to your time in the diocese?
No.
Nothing at all?
Nothing that I can recall.
Have you heard any of the evidence that has been called in relation to the Diocese of Ballarat either on the first occasion in May last year or the second occasion in December last year?
No, I think I might have seen something in the paper about.
Have you spoken to anyone who you have worked with in the church since the Royal Commission has begun its inquiries in public into what was your diocese for over a quarter of a century?
Well, not that I can. But I mean, I've spoken to people who were in the diocese when I was bishop.
And have you spoken to them about this inquiry and what's happening in this inquiry?
No, I haven't.
Haven't spoken to anyone about that?
Not as far as I can recall.
What about any of your consultants over the years? Have you spoken to any of them?
No, not that I can recall. I've obviously spoken to them as priests that I've known, and I have spoken to them, but not about the inquiries that have been done.
Seems remarkable, given that this is now the third inquiry that the Royal Commission has concerned itself with the Ballarat diocese, and when you were the bishop for that very long time, that has not been the subject of a discussion with anyone you knew and worked with during that period of time. What do you say to that?
Well, I can only say that I don't recall any such discussion.
You don't recall any discussion?
No.
Well, you've managed to recall for us some material going back some period of time, but you can't recall something that happened in the last year or so. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, you say that you, prior to being in the nursing home, lived in a house you owned. Is that right?
Yes.
Did you live with anyone else in that house?
No.
Did you have help?
Half a day a week, I had somebody come in and do some cleaning and ironing.
Mm. Were there any regular occasions where you and the priests formerly in your diocese got together since you've retired in 97?
No.
Not at all?
Well, not that I can think of.
What about occasions when you and the bishops have gotten together since you retired?
Yes, well, I have been to meals with the Bishop of Victoria, but they've not been on a business-like they've been rather social occasions.
But on social occasions, it's the case, isn't it, Bishop, that priests and bishops gossip among themselves about what's happening in various parishes with priests and parishioners?
Well, it's not usually gossiping about parishes in someone else's diocese. It's no, so I don't think there are any sort of discussions of that kind.
Well, there were certainly discussions of that kind within the diocese about various parishes and how priests and parishioners were performing.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's part of your job as bishop and the job of priests, isn't it? To take care of priests and parishioners, and in order to do so, you need to know how things are in their parish. Isn't that right?
Yeah. Yes.
And that would be a matter of discussion, I take it, within your diocese.
Yes, that is true.
Is it the case that sending priests for treatment was something that you understood was relatively commonplace, in that it was an approach that you and others used in relation to offending priests coming to your attention?
Yes, I think that's true.
Because by the mid-70s there were identified, at least in relation to Paul David Ryan, 5 opportunities for him to receive treatment. That's right?
I don't recall the occasions, but...
And you wrote letters and kept those letters about treatment, didn't you?
Yes.
It wasn't a secret.
No, I don't think so.
Perhaps if I can show you,
I'm quite
Tab,
sure what wasn't a secret.
the fact that priests were being sent for treatment.
That wasn't a secret, Bishop.
Well, I don't think so. And,
And it wasn't a secret that Paul David Ryan had been sent for treatment, was it?
no, I don't think it was public, well, knowledge among the priests anyway.
It was a knowledge amongst the priests, and certainly, I assume, amongst the consultors. Would that be right?
I would think so. I don't remember any consultation about it.
Well, Ms. Vanessa, I don't know whether the Bishop still has it, but behind tab 7 in that bundle is the minute of the consultants' meeting. I think it's the 31st of May 77. Behind tab 7, does the Bishop have that document with him? You see there, Bishop's report, you see that? About a third of the way down the first page.
Yes.
Reverend P. Ryan is at present in Washington, D.C. and will be for at least 2 years. See that?
Yes.
Now, everyone knew he was getting treatment, didn't they?
I think so.
And the reason for the treatment.
Well, as I said, my impression that there was homosexuality was the problem.
Well, you knew, didn't you, that an issue for those treating him was what they described as homosexual activity with either adults or with children. That's right?
I don't recall that.
Well, I've just taken you to that letter. Bishop, do you want me to take it to you again?
Well, which...
It's behind tab 4. Can you see that?
Yes.
So it was an issue, wasn't it, whether or not he was engaged in activity with adults or children?
Evidently. I don't...
Well, perhaps if you can turn to tab 69. This is a letter from you, Bishop, to the Reverend Father James Gill, care of the Institute of Living in Connecticut. Can you see that letter? Tab 69.
Yes.
Now, do you remember what the Institute of Living was?
No, I don't.
Now, this is not a letter you've seen recently, I take it?
No.
If you go down to the first paragraph and the second sentence, you say, "Thank you very much for your willingness to see Father Paul David Ryan."
Mm-hmm.
It seems likely, doesn't it, that this institute was an institute that provided treatment.
Yes.
So this is 1991. So from the document I took you to earlier, it seems that Paul David Ryan was receiving treatment for some 14 or 15 years.
Yeah.
Isn't that the case?
It appears to be the case, yes.
Did it occur to you that the treatment wasn't working?
Well, yeah.
I'm sorry, what was the answer to the question, Bishop?
I'm sorry, I'm just looking through
By all means, read the letter if you wish to.
further the letter.
It appears to be a letter that's setting out your knowledge of Paul David Ryan from when you first met him in 1971.
Yes.
Going through the various events concerning the seminary.
Yes.
And then his behaviour in the mid-70s.
Yeah.
And then turning to the last paragraph on page 3, but if you want to read earlier, please do so. Are you still reading the letter, Bishop?
I'm just looking at that.
The third paragraph on page 3.
Yes.
See, there's reference there to in February this year, that is 1991. The complaint was made through a priest at your cathedral to the effect that there had been some imprudent conduct with a senior schoolboy in Penshurst Parish.
Yeah.
Now, you say further down in that paragraph that it was agreed that he would remain there, that is in Penshurst, so that his change would not be seen as completely out of the ordinary.
Yeah.
So the point of keeping him there till August, notwithstanding the complaint, was to ensure that there was no scandal about him leaving earlier because there had been a complaint against him. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, this was in 1991. This is some years after the Bishops' Conference in 1988 that provided all bishops with some knowledge and understanding of child sexual abuse by clergy and religious.
Yes.
You remember that conference, don't you?
Is that the conference that Father Gill was associated with?
It was a conference that Father Usher and Lucas presented at.
Oh, I just can't.
Remember that? And they told you about what a problem it was in the States and how you had to take action here. Do you remember that?
No, I don't remember that.
So what you were doing, as appears from this letter with Paul David Ryan, was moving him in a way that wouldn't indicate that he had been the subject of a complaint. That's right?
Yes.
And you say that was agreed, and that was an agreement you reached with the mother, according to this letter, because the incident had come to light, had happened some time ago, and there appeared to be no danger that it might be repeated in the meantime. You see that?
Yes, I see that.
Well, you had no basis for saying that it wouldn't be repeated in the meantime, or that there was no danger that that would happen. Is that right?
Well, I don't recall any information.
I beg your pardon?
I don't recall any information I might have had about it.
But just reading this letter, in 1991 you were still engaged in covering up the conduct of pedophile priests, weren't you?
That wasn't my intention. So.
It's what happened, isn't it?
But then I put it to Paul David that he should leave the priesthood.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that, Bishop. Would you mind repeating it?
I put it to Paul David Ryan that he should leave the priesthood, and he refused to take action in that regard. But it has happened since that he's been dismissed from the priesthood. So I'm not. That was. I don't know the days of these things happening.
It's the case, isn't it, Bishop, that your time as the Bishop of Ballarat was characterised by offending pedophiles coming to your attention and you effectively covering up their actions so the public wouldn't become aware of it and think less highly of the church. Is that right?
Well, it's certainly not been my intention. But I can't recall the precise actions at times. But I can only say that I'm terribly sorry for the fact that I didn't act differently in the interest of everybody.
As opposed to the interests of the church.
Not as opposed to the interests of the church, it's the interests of all concerned.
But, Bishop, I think you've already told us you were concerned when these problems started to emerge to protect the reputation of the church. Is that not so?
Yeah, that would be so.
Yeah. And you did that by doing what you could to take priests away from where their offending might continue, correct?
And getting them treatment.
Well, and get them treatment, but you also removed them to avoid notoriety coming to them in one parish. You moved them to other parishes, didn't you?
Not without some activity, some treatment beforehand.
And those around you who were your advisors and who you were talking with, they knew about what was going on, didn't they?
I can't recall who knew what at that stage.
Well, certainly the knowledge that priests were in trouble with sexual activity with children, or some priests were, was known to those who were your advisors, wasn't it?
I just don't recall what was known.
You don't recall?
No.
Very well.
Just coming back to the document under tab 22, and this is coming back to the 70s, which we talked about earlier, Bishop. Have you got a copy of that letter?
Yes, I have.
Now, it seems to be a letter from John Harvey, who was in the Institute in Marylands, to you in April 1978. You see that?
I'm sorry?
It seems to be a letter from John Harvey, who was involved in that institute in Marylands I took you to earlier, to you.
Yeah.
That's right?
Yes.
Do you remember the letter?
No.
Now, do you see in the first paragraph there's reference to that Paul didn't want it to be known to another bishop that he had the specific problem for which he had been sent for America. And then it continues, naturally, I thought what would be the obligation of a bishop writing a letter of recommendation to another bishop to reveal the specific problem. Using the usual precautions, I discussed the matter with another professional moralist. He felt that the most you would have to admit would be that your priest was under the care of a therapist and spiritual director. You see that?
Yes.
What you were being given was a way in which you could move, in the case of Paul David Ryan, to another parish without telling those at the parish, or indeed another diocese, without telling them or warning them of his problem? That's what you're being told, isn't it?
It looks like it, yes.
Now, is it the case that when you moved, the various priests in your diocese who you knew or believed had been offending to other parishes, you deliberately didn't tell anyone in the incoming parish about what you knew?
No, that would not be so.
So it would be the case that you would convey to those in the new parish what you knew about the priest who was coming to them. Is that right?
I should think so, but I honestly can't remember.
So is it the case also that when you sent priests, let's use Gerald Ridsdale as an example, to Sydney, you told those who were in the areas in which he would be working what you knew about him?
Yes, well, it's in the... I'm trying to think of the position.
At the Catholic Inquiry Centre? Is that what you're thinking?
Inquiry, yeah.
They knew of his problems, didn't they?
Well, I certainly told the Archbishop of Sydney.
And you told the director of the centre as well?
I don't remember that.
Is it the case that because you thought these priests were receiving adequate and effective treatment, you could talk about their offending?
I'm not sure about it. About who talked to about the event.
Your Honour, I note it's nearly 11 o'clock and from my recollection of the medical report in relation to Bishop Mulcairn's, it was that he couldn't continue over an hour and a half and then would need several days at least to recover before being asked questions again.
Are the council aware of that? You are?
So I appear for Bishop Mulcairn's. We outlined that in open commission before you some weeks ago, and copies of the report were provided to those.
I understand that. I'm just checking to make sure everyone knows. Yes. Is it, as Bishop Mulcairn's advocate, is that what you wish to happen?
Yes.
Be adjourned now?
Yes.
With what course do you propose, Ms. Finesse?
He could go.
Ms. Finesse?
He could give evidence by video link next week. With council assisting at an appropriate time in the future to continue the evidence by video link.
Yes. Well, I think we have no choice. Does anyone want to say anything about it? No. Well, Bishop, we're conscious of your medical condition and of the medical advice, and your counsel confirms that it would be appropriate for us to adjourn your evidence now so that on another occasion you are able to continue to give your evidence. Do you understand?
Yes.
What I'm going to do then is thank you for your evidence today. I'm going to adjourn your evidence. I'm not going to excuse you from further attendance, but we will organise a further day or a further occasion when your evidence can continue. Do you understand?
Yes.
Very well. Thank you. Ms Finesse.
Your Honour, there's a final witness today who I anticipate will be short.
Do your colleagues share that view?
Well, my only colleague that I think matters shares that view, and that there's only one who's indicated she has questions to ask the witness.
So do you wish to continue, or should we take a short break?
Oh, perhaps a short break, but with the emphasis on short, Your Honour.
10 minutes.